Okay, well, hopefully by now you've had a chance to explore some of the texturing options that are available inside of Maya. I'm going to bring this up real quick. By now, if you have not watched the videos that I made available, the ones that I've created myself that are on YouTube, you'll see here that there's a lot of really good information, especially in Week 2, 3D Modeling Week 2, where you can see some of the tricks and some of the simplification that you can do in order to create textures a little bit more efficiently. Some of these things can also be found in the other video from Digital Tutors that I had requested or suggested that you check out using the Beginner's Guide to Shading Networks. Just want to make sure that you've had a chance to watch those, because what we're going to start looking at next will definitely need you to understand those concepts first. Okay, now we've talked about this in other classes, but I didn't raise it in the last class for this course. What we're looking at right now is a wireframe. Of course, this is simply because we can see the outlines of the objects and we can see through them. If I hit my 4 key, then this is what I'm going to see. If I hit the number 5 key, then I'm going to get my shaded view. If I hit my 6 key, I'm going to get a textured version, or at least the computer's best guess of what I have. And because I have a light in my scene, if I hit the 7 key, it will also show me what that looks like. And you can see that as I move it around, we start to get at least a general idea of what the lighting is going to be doing. Now, it's not showing us things like casting shadows or anything like that, and you can see that it is fairly low quality, but it's just for preview purposes. It's just to get an idea of what your shapes are going to end up looking like. Now, there are other things that you can do, but please be aware that what I'm about to show you requires a really powerful graphics card. In fact, sometimes when you come over to these options, they're not even available. And if they're not available, that doesn't mean that the computer has a glitch. It simply means that Maya recognizes that your computer, for example, if you have a laptop or a computer that might be a little bit older and doesn't have that much video 3D type power, it'll simply look at it and say, you know what, this isn't the computer to try this trick. So if I come over into my renderer and notice that I'm not talking about render options up at the top. I'm actually talking about the render options inside of each view. Okay? Now, each viewport has these options, and so you can turn them on and off for each window, but just remember that if you turned it on for one window, that doesn't mean you turned it on for another. So I'm going to drop open the renderer, and you notice here it says I'm using the default quality renderer. Well, what that means is that Maya is not using a lot of sophisticated power or extra RAM from the computer or asking too much of the computer, because you're simply trying to work faster. If I switch over to my high quality rendering, you notice that it takes a second, and suddenly we start to see that if some of my shapes have bump mapping on them, we start to actually see that bump mapping visible in this scene, almost like it's a video game. Now, the nice thing about this is as I start to move my light, it really does show what the bump map is doing. But again, keep in mind that this is all a preview, and it still doesn't guarantee that this is the final result. You might also notice that all of my NURBS spheres have become very jagged. Well, that's because this view is expecting polygons. And so because all of my spheres are NURBS objects, this is happening. Keep in mind, though, if I were to create a polygon sphere, it's not trying to simplify this one. Okay? So don't be afraid if you used NURBS spheres to create these objects. It's simply a matter of what the graphics card thinks you want. And it says, well, you're asking to see textures first, so I'm going to show you the textures. Now, we can also go into what's known as Viewport 2.0, and what this is an even more sophisticated shading apparatus. You can see now, suddenly, the computer is using even more information to show me my NURBS objects in a smooth preview. Now, your graphics card really has to be up to par for this. This isn't the sort of thing that we can just ask any computer to do. And in fact, if you tried on a computer that's not really as powerful as it should be, then you could probably find yourself in some serious problems. The computer would be very slow, you wouldn't be able to move around, it would feel sluggish. Just to let you know, I rarely turn this on because even though it is useful and it is prettier, it's still not showing me exactly what I'm going to end up with. The only way that you can do that is, of course, to render. But I did want you to at least see that because it might help you along when you're doing some of your texture work. Again, just like how this view right here doesn't give you exactly what you want, but it does give you a nice preview. It gives you an idea of what you're doing so that you don't necessarily have to start rendering right away. Now, that aside, let's start talking about our rendering. Now, I'm going to just remind everybody that right now we're using the Maya software render, and I set it to use its high quality rendering, and just like what we talked about, I'm using the preset to make an HD image. And we can see that that HD image is visible because I had the resolution gate turned on. Now without it, I don't exactly know what really is going to be in my shot. And it's very important to set up your image the way that you know you want it and not just guess and hope for the best. Now with this light, I've already turned on Use Depth Map Shadows, as you can see here, and I'm just keeping it the default resolution at the moment. We're just going to take a quick test render. Okay, now you can see that we have shadows, and hopefully this is bright enough on the screen. I'll go ahead and just boost the brightness here, just in case. Now be aware, I'm purposely making my image look a little uglier just so that we can see this on the screen a little easier. And we see instantly that these shadows are not really doing what they're supposed to do. For example, we have issues like this semi-transparent sphere right here is casting a 100% dark shadow. This is again one of those limitations to using the depth map shadow options. We talked about how this is for simple things and definitely for background situations. I'm going to show you another use for the depth map shadow when we get into using rather sophisticated lighting setups, something that actually Pixar does. I'm going to teach you guys all about that stuff, but not right now. First, we're just going to start talking about the difference between this depth map shadow and the Raytrace shadow. Okay, so if I wanted to, I could increase the resolution. That would smooth things out, but because I'm including things like transparent and semi-transparent objects, if I want my shadows to really work, then depth map shadows is definitely not going to be the way to go. That's because depth map shadows, because it's simply looking at the geometry, does not take into account things that are semi-transparent. It says, look, this is an object, casting a shadow, done deal. So I'm going to turn off Use Depth Map Shadows, and I'm going to slide further down to the bottom of the shadow options that says Raytrace Shadow Attributes. Now I'm going to turn this on, and of course the very first time we render this, nothing happens. And we talked about why nothing happens, and that's simply because inside of my render settings, Maya software does not assume that Raytrace quality should be something that it should be on by default. So it simply says, look, if you want ray tracing, you have to turn it on yourself. So I'm going to say, okay, I want ray tracing. Now you'll notice that ray tracing is not just for shadows. It's also for reflections and for refractions, which we'll get into in a little bit. Now I can keep the reflections on right now, or I can turn them off. The nice thing about refractions, reflections. The nice thing about refractions, though, is that if your objects have no refraction set up for the scene, then it's not going to calculate it, but I normally set it to 0 anyway. That way, as soon as I hit the render button, I'm already telling Maya Don't even worry about looking around to see if something is refractive. Just don't have it. By the way, refraction is actually the mathematical bending of light. So if you can think about it, if anybody in the room is wearing glasses, they are using refraction so that they can see properly. If you've ever used a magnifying glass or a telescope or anything else, we're bending light to either enlarge or shrink or change the view. If you have a glass of water and you put a straw in it and you look through the glass, it seems as though the straw has bent. That's because the light is bending through the water. So that's really what refraction is. And right now we don't have any of those options turned on, so I'm just going to leave them set to 0. Now, right now we have shadows set to 2. Now, why would we need 2 shadows? Well, you'll see in a minute. When I hit render now, of course the calculations are going to take a little bit longer because we have both reflection and we have shadows that are being cast using ray tracing. The first thing that you might notice is that the solid objects have black solid shadows, but the semi-transparent objects have semi-transparent shadows. This is a really useful thing because it's going to help our objects feel more realistic. Now you might be wondering why the outer edge of this object is much darker than it is in the middle. Well, that's because there's more surface on the outer edges than there are in the middle. So you can think about it in terms of a light ray coming into the object from the center, having nothing to stop it until it reaches the other side and popping out. Whereas the outer edge has a lot of surface that's actually looking at to get through that object. Okay? Now, the number of rays that we're calculating becomes very important, especially when we're talking about transparent objects, because we have to think about it in terms of this light shooting a beam over to that object. Now, if we think about it in terms of how many sides this object has, we have an outer side and we have a back side, which means that the beam of light that's going to create the shadow has to travel through 1, 2, and then finally reach its destination. Now what that means is that this light is going to have 3 ray depth limits. Now the ray depth limit says if we have lots and lots of transparent objects on top of each other, eventually this light is going to have to either go through every single layer to reach the bottom, or it's going to stop at a certain level. Now keep in mind though, just because you have a certain depth limit doesn't mean that when it reaches the limit of Raytrace rays, it's not going to simply ignore casting a shadow. All it means is it's not going to make it exactly accurate, but in some cases you'll still get a good result because nobody's going to notice whether or not 1 layer or 2 layers of many transparent objects are still casting an accurate shadow. Keep in mind though, the rule of thumb is the number of rays for every single light has to be set. The rays are custom for each individual light. The nice thing about everything that we've been talking about thus far shows us that it works just fine inside of the software render. Maya's software render is very useful, especially for simple things, but when we start to need more quality, when we start to really need more accuracy, when we start to need more subtlety, and by the way, all of these words are very useful to start describing the kind of effect that you're going for, it's often a really good idea to move from the Maya software render into a more robust, more sophisticated type of rendering software. Now, if we simply move up into our Render tab, we should have that option already enabled. If it's not, I'll show you how to get to it. So if we look here, we see that right now the computer is using the software, the Maya software render, but there's a tab. If I drop this open, there should be several different tabs here, and if one of them is not Mental Ray, then you're going to have to load that, and I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so if you've already got Mental Ray as one of your options, go ahead and turn it on. It'll take a second, but then we'll have all of these new little tabs that we'll have to look at. If you don't have that available yet, then this is what you'll have to do. You're going to move over to your Window Options. You're going to go to Settings and Preferences, and at the bottom of your Settings and Preferences is what's known as the Plugin Manager. Now when I open up the Plugin Manager, I'm going to get this great big list. Inside of this, we're looking for one very important node, and it's usually down here towards the bottom. It should be loaded as, and it's called Maya 2MR. Now if it's not located down here at the bottom, you may have it on your computer listed inside of this. But what you're looking for is the one called Maya 2MR.mll. MLL is simply a little scripting language that Maya uses. Now, once you find that one, I want you to turn on the Loaded checkbox, and what that means is it will be loaded for this session. In other words, this time that you open up Maya, you'll have it. Auto load means that the next time you open up Maya, it will automatically be there. Now by default this option should be turned on, but sometimes because we're working in an environment where a lot of different people are using these programs, it could very well come to a situation where this is simply not on. So the easiest thing to do is to check these on and then close. Now when you come back to your render settings, you may have to just close it out and then open it back up, just to make sure that the computer is refreshed completely. But by now you should definitely have the Mental Ray option. Okay? Now, just a quick little overview of what Mental Ray is. We know that the program or the company, Autodesk, makes Maya. Well, Mental Ray is actually made by a separate company, and they've made their render program available in this program for us. Now, Mental Ray is widely used. It's in 3D Studio Max. It's in Softimage. It's in a lot of different other programs. Now, the Mental Ray, what it really is it's simply the final image making software. Now, Mental Ray also comes with a lot of custom shaders, and I would say that you can play around with them, but keep in mind that that's not really what this class is going to be, not right now, okay? Mental Ray has some very sophisticated shaders. They have things like a very unique metal flake paint, like for car paint. They have some really neat things in there. You're free to explore them, and of course Digital Tutors has a lot of different videos on them, and I do believe that our book that we'll be using for this class has some mention of these shaders, but we will be getting into those a little bit later. Okay, so we notice that the Common tab, the first one, doesn't seem to have changed at all, and that's why all of these settings are in the Common tab, because nothing really changes. Now, if I slide all the way down to my Commons tab, we talked about this previously, but I'm just going to make sure that the Enable Default Light is shut off. If the Enable Default Light is on, sometimes a light that we never really wanted just sort of appears in our scene. Now, usually that light disappears when we create a light, but I'm always of the mind where if I keep that off, when I start getting into the more sophisticated settings, and you'll see that next week, that option should definitely be shut off. The next tab we have is called Passes. Now, we're not going to worry about that just yet. We're going to get into rendering passes and rendering in layers in a little bit, but let's just pass by that one. We'll also pass by the Features tab because that just gives you an overview of what the rest of the tabs will have. Now, if I switch on to the Quality tab, it always takes an extra second to finally load this, so just be patient. We notice first that the Quality preset is set to Draft. Now, strangely enough, back at the Maya software, I had already set this to High Quality. Keep in mind that this is a whole new set of render settings. Just because you had it set to High Quality before doesn't mean that it's High Quality now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to slide down, and you'll notice that there are a lot more options. Things like caustics and final gather and global illumination. We're not going to worry about those just yet, but don't worry, we're going to get to those. I'm going to just come over here to the production option. Now, as soon as I do that, you'll notice that instantly this thing called adaptive sampling has a maximum level of 2. What it means is that every single pixel will get at least one sample or one diagnosis, and at the most up to 16. What that's going to do is it's going to ensure that my image quality is as good as possible. Now, can we increase that number? Of course we can. But eventually, we're going to reach a point where the computer is simply going to take way too long to reach the quality we want. So if I were to move this up, we notice that now we're looking at 64 samples per pixel. Now, if we were doing something like 4K animation or something that was going to go into the theater, we might need to go this high for certain special effects or water or, vast environments. But for our purposes, even for HD images, a level of 2 is really good. So we're going to keep it there. Now, underneath the multi-pixel filtering, that's just a big long word for, am I putting any kind of little post-softening to my image? Sometimes images can be so stark that they actually hurt when they move around. Putting a little bit of a blur on it can help. Now, I don't usually use the Gaussian blur, and depending on which video you watch, everybody seems to have their own option. I really like using the box filter at 1:1. What it does is it just ever so slightly puts a little bit of a softness on very sharp edges so that it all sort of feels like it works together. Now, there may be times when you won't want any kind of a filter at all, which simply means that if you were going to have a filter of some sort, you just set these filter sizes to 0, and you got no problem. If you're doing things, for example, like posters, for print, that sharpness might be exactly what you need, but of course you'll also be rendering a lot bigger. Now, let's open up the Raytrace options, and you'll notice that instantly our Raytrace options are already turned on. That's because by default, Mental Ray is already robust enough to say, look, if you're using me, you're going to have Raytrace shadows somehow. But we might notice that we have pretty high layers turned on right now. My reflections are turned up to 10. My refractions are also 10. And look at this, max trace depth is up to 20. Now, where did we see the trace depth or that depth option before? Inside of my light, we had a ray depth limit. So this option here, this max trace depth, coincides with these numbers. So for example, if I had on my light, it needed, let's say, 10 different rays, but over here in my renderer, I only have this set to 3, this is going to trump the options that I have in my light. So this is a nice way of sort of making sure you didn't make any awful mistakes in any of your lights that are simply going to slow you down. Now, of course, when we start making environments or we start doing things that are maybe interiors or, things that might need multiple lights, of course, most times we need multiple lights, but we're just dealing with one right now for example purposes. Eventually, you might have so many lights in the scene that it's going to start getting hard to remember exactly what your limit was. If you can set the max limit to something a little more even, something maybe at most 10. I usually probably keep it under that, but we'll stick to that for now. Refractions I can set to 0 because there are none yet, and then we'll just say reflections of 2. Okay? Now, reflections of 2 mean that if I have a reflective object that is reflecting a reflective object, the reflection of the reflected object will still have the reflection. Now, I know that that was a maddening set of words that I just said, but what it basically means is this. This object has reflections, and this object has reflections. But if that number was only set to 1, then when we see this object in this object's reflection, it would seem that this object had no reflections at all when we looked at it over here. So if I render it right now, we'll see if that makes a little bit more sense once we actually see it. And you'll notice that it's taking a bit more time to render because Mental Ray is a more accurate render type, but it's still definitely worth it because it's going to give you the quality that you want. Okay, here we have an object that has reflections, and you can see all the other spheres. And in this object, you can see all the other spheres, and in this object, you can see all the other spheres. But if we look closely, we see that there's a giant problem when we look at a reflection of a reflective object. There's no reflection in the object that's supposed to be reflecting. And the solution isn't simply to increase the max trace depth or the reflections. You can turn these numbers up as high as you want, and it's still not going to solve your problem. That's because Maya has built in some of these Raytrace options into the shaders themselves. Now, just like how our light had its own ray depth limit, the shader itself knows that if it found itself having to reflect a reflection of 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 a reflection and so on, then the render time would simply be impossible to deal with. So inside of its shader, if we slide further down, there's a tab right here for ray tracing options. Now, if I slide a little bit further down, it's going to reveal the reflection limit. Notice that this only has one reflection. That means that once it has reflected something, or it has been reflected, then that's going to be as far as it goes. So what that means is I have to turn that up to at least 2, and I'll do it for both of these objects to ensure that they both have that option turned on. So here it is, ray tracing again. Sliding down, there's the reflection limit. Change that over to 2. And now let's take a new render. And I'm going to pause the video just to make sure we don't have to sit. Okay, so that took a little while. It actually took 3 minutes on my computer, but remember I was also increasing these numbers to a crazy amount. I had 20 reflections and a 40 max trace. Just remember, these numbers can be reduced. The simple solution is reduce them until the renders start looking wrong. That's the easiest way to say it. Now, because I've already set both of these to now reflect twice, you can see that inside of the image, we see the reflection of the reflected object in the reflection, and we see it over here too. Now this sphere is a reflective object. Now depending on how many times we really had to reflect or reflect or reflect, it's definitely going to increase the render time, but it now looks much more believable because it's reflecting the way that we would expect. Now, our reflections are definitely helping to improve the quality of our image. But what's also going to improve the quality of the image is the reality or the believability of my lighting scenario. In most cases, lights aren't very sharp when they create shadow. And the reason is that unless the energy of the light is so powerful that the ray is going to shoot without any disturbance in the atmosphere, things soften. And when we have things like bounced light or diffused light, we'll talk about all those different kinds of things throughout the course. The edges of light's shadows start to soften out because they're starting to be broken apart. But when we look here, and I'll just use this side, I'm going to set some of my render settings much lower just so that they render a bit faster. I'll say the max trace total can be 10, and then the shadows can be 2. That way it'll just start rendering a little bit faster. When I render this image, I may still have to pause the video if it's going to take a little longer than I want to. Okay, so that took less than a minute to render. And remember, I'm also rendering these in full quality at full resolution. I know when we talked in the last class, I mentioned that starting out with smaller images just to get your general lighting scenario set up is always a good idea. But because I keep zooming in to these images to show you what we're talking about, I'm just going to go ahead and use the full size. Since I'm not dealing with any deadline or anything like that, I can just pause the video. It's not a big deal. But when we look at this image, the shadow is super sharp. And even when I start to zoom in bigger than 100%, it's a very, very sharp image. Well, if we wanted to start creating more emotion, more mood, more subtlety, then what we're going to have to start doing is softening out our shadows. Now, I'm going to warn you, because softening out Raytrace shadows will increase the render time. I'm going to show you some of the techniques here, and then as we progress through the course, we will be finding new and more, I'd say, sophisticated yet easier ways to create softer shadows. But what we're going to do is we're going to look back at my light, and in here we have the light radius. Now currently the light radius is set to 0. If you can imagine a beam of light, it moves in a straight line, like an arrow. If you were to increase the angle of that one arrow, the radius would be how far that one little beam of light would be able to start bending. Okay? Now, right now, the radius is very small. In fact, it's 0. If I change this to something, let's just say 10, and we're just going to change that number for right now. I'm going to re-render this one little area, and you do that simply by creating a marquee over that space. Okay, so you create a marquee over that space, and you either have to use this button right here that says render the region that I selected, or you can go into your options, and I've turned on auto render region, which means when I create this shape, it's going to know that I want to render just that area. Notice now that my shadow has really started to soften out. And you can see that this was the original sharpness of it, and now it's starting to create this little gradient. Now, the higher the number I go here, the light radius, so that was 5. Let's see what happens if I change it to 10. And what I'll do is I'll select a new region so you can see the progression. Okay, so now with a radius of 10, we've really softened it up. But at the same time, what we've done is we've also created this sort of annoying noise. Now, shadows don't necessarily want noise, but we do want softness. And that's what this setting right next to the light radius is, the shadow rays. If the light ray, the single light ray, is bending by 10 degrees, then what we need to do is we need to increase the rays that it's bending to soften or smooth out this calculation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that number from 1, and we'll just change it to 5. And I'll talk about how you figure out what numbers these should be in a minute. Okay, now, I know for a fact that the render times are definitely going to start to pick up a little bit. But instantly you notice that with just increasing the rays to 5, this has become considerably different. We're starting to smooth out all of those little pixels. It was very rough, and it's still rough, but it's starting to smooth out a bit more. If I were to increase that number to 10 and take yet another render of it, then we're starting to see an even better improvement. So, starting from the beginning, this was when the radius was 0 and the ray was 1. This area right here is we're talking about a radius of 5 with a light ray or shadow ray of just 1. And as we've increased both of these numbers, the quality of that soft shadow is starting to improve. Now, I wouldn't really want to go much higher than 10 on a shadow like this, but the shadow rays would probably have to be at least double whatever the number of light radius are. For the most part, I usually make that number 3 times for my final rendering, so if I was going to go with a 10, I would actually increase the shadow rays to 30. So you can imagine how much more time that render would take. Now, I'm going to go ahead and render this entire image out, and I'm going to have to pause the video again. Okay, that render took over 4 minutes. But of course we're dealing with a very large image, and we're dealing with a lot of information in the scene. But look at how nice the softness of that shadow is starting to look. Okay, now so far I've only been using this one light to demonstrate all of these different lighting shadow options and such. I'm just going to go ahead and delete that one light, and I'm going to create a new light. And up until this point, we've only been looking at the point light, but in other classes I've, of course, talked about directional lights and spotlights and things like that. I'm going to grab one of the spotlights, and because it's so small in this particular scene, I'm going to increase the size. And we don't see it lighting any of my objects because right now it's aiming in the wrong direction. Now, there's a nice little trick that you can do with a lot of these different lights, especially the ones that have a particular direction. We all know that the W key moves the object around, okay? And the E key will rotate it up and down or side to side or and then the R key scales. Well, if we hit the T, you notice that suddenly we get 2 controllers. That's because the T is to target, and I can grab that and actually move it into a position that I decide is the right spot to put it in. Now, I'm sure that this is pretty dark, so let me just back up a little bit and see if I can maybe make some better lighting so that you can see the 3D view a little easier. The next thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to turn on the viewport option that we talked about earlier. This way, I can see exactly where my light really is going to cast. Now, just like with our other problem, the edge of a light, or the boundary where the light stops, imagine a flashlight or something that has a cone of light direction. Well, that light is stopping because it's technically the shadow of the object that's around the light. So we know that this area certainly shouldn't be rendering quite so sharp. And of course, if I render that image out, you'll see what I mean. And again, I may have to pause the video if the render takes too long. Okay. So once again we have this problem where a light source looks like it's got this very sharp edge. Now if you're going for something that's stylized or something that you feel that would be a good solution, like direct sunlight coming through a window, then of course a sharp shadow would be exactly what you want. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my lighting options, and we see that here we have my options already open. And I'm going to go just underneath where the cone angle is. And of course the cone angle is simply how wide the light is. If I pull that out a little bit further, you see that the light expands or contracts. But instead of changing that, I'm just going to keep that the way it was. The penumbra angle, the angle is the softness of the outer edge. Now, you notice that right now we have it set to 0, but instead of the little scroll bar going to the end, it starts in the middle. That's because the penumbra angle can go inside from where the light existed, or it can spread beyond where that light existed. Now, what it basically means is if you increase the penumbra angle, then we're going to cast light a little further than the cone angle was set. And if we bring it in, then now it starts to die away to the point where it used to stop. Okay? It's going to be entirely up to you as to which one of those you would prefer. But now when I render this, notice the difference that changing that penumbra angle makes on this light. Okay, so now it's starting to feel like a real light should. Now what we can also do is we can add a little bit of drop-off. And what the drop-off is it says light can't possibly be exactly even all the way through. So if I change this to something simple like 5, it's not going to seem like a big deal, but when I render it, you're going to see a big change. And again, I'll probably have to pause the video. Okay, so now you can see that the center of the light all the way to the outer edge of the light isn't even all the way through. It's kind of odd to think about it this way, even though everything that we're doing here is remarkably fake. The one thing that we don't want to do is create something that looks too artificial. Now, as of right now, my light seems very wrong, and that's because this is a new light, and even though when I look at my render settings, ray tracing is on, shadows are on, the light itself has not been told to cast any shadows. So once again, I'm going to slide down to my ray trace shadow options. I'm going to turn it on, and this time I'm going to take my light radius to 5 and my shadow rays to 15. Now remember, like I said, I usually take it 3 times the amount of the light radius. And then for the ray depth limit, I'm going to turn this to 5. Now I know for sure that this is going to take a while to render, so I'm going to pause the video and we'll see what this looks like now. Next. Alright, so after 3 minutes and 24 seconds, here's my final image. And you can see that we have the right reflections we were expecting. We have a little bit of a softer shadow. If I wanted to, I could increase that. That wouldn't be too big of a deal. What you'll be doing for the next, I don't know, half hour, 45 minutes or so, is to update the lighting and the quality of your overall objects in your spheres. So we already made the 8 preliminary images, the before pictures, and then what I'd like you to do is to create the after pictures. Now this is something that we didn't actually mention in the class because it's assumed that you guys have already done these things before, but all of the images that I've been creating in this preview view have not been saved. They've been simply temporary files. If I wanted to save this picture, I have to go to File, Save Image, and notice that because I've already set my project, it's waiting for me in my Images folder. If you're unfamiliar with these things, please make sure you start to dive into Maya a little bit harder, because setting your project will make sure that the images are going to the right place. So you would simply save your image as an after picture 01, something like that. Okay, so this is the end of this video. you'll have some time to go over it and then maybe critique your before and after pictures together to see the progress that you've made. Feel free to use multiple shadows, multiple lights. Use three-point lighting. We've talked about that. We'll talk about that more as the class progresses. And I look forward to seeing what you've made. Once your critique is over, there will be another very short video simply introducing what the next assignment is going to be, and you'll be able to continue working on that assignment until it's due next week. Okay, so good luck and have fun.